They say space changes you, but they forget that humans change space right back. When Josephine stumbled into the sanctuary, blood seeping through makeshift bandages, the galaxy's most lethal apex predators didn't cower. They smelled the iron on her wrists. They smelled the betrayal. And then they went to war. The Tartarus Basin on Kepler 186f was not meant for human habitation. Under the dim, crimson glow of the red dwarf star, the flora grew in jagged, obsidian-hued leaves, and the fauna was uniformly hostile. Yet, for Dr. Josephine Croft, a senior xenoconservationist operating under a grant from the Jane Goodall Institute's Exoplanet Division, it was paradise. Josephine stood in the center of the reinforced geodesic dome of Outpost Delta, her boots sinking slightly into the synthetic soil. She held a titanium feeding pail, the scent of synthesized protein slurry heavy in the humid air. "Liam, Alaric, come on, you overgrown carpets," she called out, her voice echoing off the reinforced plasteel walls. From the shadows of the artificial jungle biome, two massive silhouettes detached themselves. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that betrayed their immense bulk. These were the Apexia tartarus, colloquially known by the colony miners as ursavines. Imagine a Terran grizzly bear crossed with a snow leopard, possessing 6 muscular limbs, an interlocking scute's armored spine, and jaws that could snap a titanium strut like a dry twig. They were the undisputed apex predators of this world, and right now, they were practically purring. Liam, the larger of the two males, reached Josephine first. He nudged her shoulder with a massive, wedge-shaped head, nearly knocking her off her feet. His purr was a low, subsonic vibration that Josephine felt in her molars and deep within her chest cavity. Alaric trotted up seconds later, letting out a series of high-pitched clicks and chuffs, demanding equal attention. All right. Easy, boys," Josephine laughed, scratching Alaric right behind the armored plating of his secondary ears. "You act like I haven't fed you in weeks. It's been exactly 4 hours." Josephine had raised the cubs since they were the size of Terran spaniels. 2 years ago, a crew of illegal poachers had decimated their mother for her rare, subdermal neuroglands, a highly sought-after commodity on the black market for producing synthetic adrenaline. Josephine had found the cubs shivering in a hollowed-out root system. The bond they had formed since then was the subject of intense study back on Earth. Humans, it seemed, had an unparalleled capacity for pack bonding. But what fascinated the xenobiologists wasn't just Josephine's empathy. It was the Ursavine's reciprocation. The creatures had imprinted on her. To them, the fragile, soft-skinned human was not prey. She was their matriarch. She was pack. As the cubs devoured the protein slurry, Josephine's wristpad chimed, flashing a harsh, authoritative amber light. The sterile tone cut through the serene atmosphere of the dome. She tapped the receiver. "Croft. Dr. Croft. This is Darian Eris." The voice on the other end was smooth, practiced, and entirely devoid of warmth. Eris was the regional director for Hemlock Faulkner Mining, the megacorporation that essentially owned the New Jamestown colony. "We require your presence at the corporate administrative spire. Immediately." Josephine frowned, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "I have a scheduled perimeter check, Darian. Whatever this is, it can wait." "I'm afraid it cannot, Josephine," Eris replied smoothly. "This concerns the zoning permits for Sector 4, the land your sanctuary currently occupies. If you aren't in my office within the hour, I will be forced to send Security Chief Cole to escort you. And I know how much you dislike Vincent." The line went dead. Josephine stared at her wristpad, her jaw set tight. Sector 4 was federally protected land, ratified by the UN Exoplanetary Commission. But Hemlock Faulkner had recently discovered a massive vein of palladium isotope beneath the Tartarus Basin. The corporation had been deploying legal loopholes, lobbying politicians back on Earth, and harassing her operation for months. Liam, sensing the sudden shift in her heart rate and the subtle pheromonal changes of human anxiety, stopped eating. He lifted his massive head, his 4 amber eyes locking onto Josephine. He let out a low, questioning rumble. "It's okay, Liam," Josephine whispered, resting her forehead against his coarse, armored snout. The creature was warm, smelling of ozone and crushed ferns. "I just have to go deal with the suits." You and Alaric hold down the fort. She locked the sanctuary dome behind her, stepping out into the harsh, red-tinted atmosphere of the colony. She caught the maglev transit towards the towering, brutalist structure of the Hemlock Faulkner spire, unaware that she was walking into a trap that would test the very limits of human endurance and alien loyalty. The Hemlock Faulkner corporate spire was a monument to human greed and engineering, a towering monolith of plasteel and mirrored glass that pierced the smog-choked sky of New Jamestown. Inside, the climate control was set to a crisp, freezing temperature that felt alien compared to the humid warmth of Josephine's sanctuary. Josephine sat across a sprawling obsidian desk from Darian Eris. Aris wore an impeccably tailored suit that cost more than Josephine's annual research grant. Standing in the shadows near the door was Vincent Cole, the chief of security. Cole was a mountain of a man with a cybernetic optical implant that glowed a faint, menacing crimson. He was ex-military, discharged under murky circumstances involving corporate espionage and excessive force. "I'm not signing it, Darian," Josephine said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She pushed the sleek, illuminated datapad back across the desk. The UN Charter clearly states that the Tartarus Basin is a Class A ecological preserve. You don't have the legal authority to seize the land. Eris sighed, steepling his fingers. "Josephine, you are a brilliant biologist, but you are remarkably naive when it comes to the realities of frontier economics. That palladium vein beneath your sanctuary is worth trillions. It could fund the terraforming of 3 new colonies, and you are standing in the way of progress for the sake of 2 oversized, dangerous animals. They are sentient, highly intelligent beings," Josephine shot back, her eyes narrowing, "and they have more humanity in them than anyone in this room." Eris dropped his hands, his facade of polite patience evaporating. "The UN Charter has an override clause for critical strategic resources. Josephine, we activated it this morning. A Lockheed Martin exoplanet transport is already in orbit, bringing heavy excavation gear. Your lease is terminated. We just need your biometric signature acknowledging the transfer of assets, and we will generously compensate you for your relocation." "No." Josephine stood up, planting her hands firmly on the desk. "I'm taking this to the Colonial Magistrate. If you try to move diggers into Sector 4, I will chain myself to the perimeter gates. I'm leaving." She turned toward the door, but Vincent Cole moved with startling speed, blocking her path. The director wasn't asking, "Dr. Croft," Cole growled, his voice like grinding gravel. Before Josephine could react, Cole lunged. He grabbed her left arm, twisting it painfully behind her back. Josephine gasped, struggling against his iron grip, but he was too strong. With his free hand, Cole pulled a pair of tactical restraint bands from his belt. Subdermal compliance cuffs. They were illegal in core systems, designed by military contractors to force prisoners to comply with biometric scanners. Lined with microscopic, razor-sharp kinetic teeth, they dug into the flesh, interfacing directly with the pain receptors and locking the victim's hands together. Cole slapped the bands onto Josephine's wrists. The metal snapped shut. Immediately, the micro-teeth bit into her skin. Josephine let out a sharp cry of agony as a searing electrical fire shot up her forearms. "Bring her to the desk, Vincent," Eris commanded coldly. "Force her thumb onto the scanner." "You bastards," Josephine hissed through gritted teeth, her vision blurring from the pain. Cole shoved her forward, slamming her chest into the edge of the obsidian desk. He grabbed her bound hands, attempting to drag her thumb toward the glowing green biometric pad. The cuffs tightened, the razor teeth digging deeper, cutting through the dermal layers and drawing bright, crimson blood. Josephine looked at the datapad. If her thumb touched it, the sanctuary was gone. Liam and Alaric would be euthanized as dangerous native hazards by Hemlock Faulkner security forces. The thought of those magnificent creatures being gunned down ignited something primal inside her. A surge of sheer, desperate human willpower overtook the pain. I said, "No." With a guttural scream, Josephine didn't pull away from Cole. She yanked her arms violently in opposite directions. The compliance cuffs, designed to punish resistance, clamped down tighter, the blades sinking into her flesh. But Josephine didn't stop. She twisted her wrists with brutal, sickening force. The metal tore through skin, muscle, and a superficial vein. Blood splattered across the pristine obsidian desk. splashing over the glowing datapad and short-circuiting the scanner with a fizzle of sparks. Cole cursed, stumbling back in surprise as the blood hit his face. The cuffs, their internal sensors, confused by the massive tissue damage and the shorted scanner, suddenly disengaged with a mechanical click, dropping heavily to the floor. Josephine staggered back, cradling her arms. Blood was pouring from deep lacerations around both wrists, dripping rapidly onto the immaculate carpet. She looked at Eris, her face pale, chest heaving, but her eyes burning with a terrifying, wild defiance. "Scanner's broken, Darian," she spat, her voice shaking but victorious. "Guess you'll have to take me to court." Before Cole could recover and grab her again, Josephine slammed her shoulder into the heavy oak door, bursting out into the hallway. The corridor was filled with mid-level executives, and crucially, 2 UN labor observers, who immediately turned in shock at the sight of the bleeding xenobiologist. Eris and Cole couldn't touch her now. Not with witnesses. Josephine practically fell into the maglev train, ignoring the horrified stares of the miners and colonists. She tore strips from her heavy cotton overshirt, wrapping them tightly around her wrists to stem the bleeding. The pain was agonizing, a constant throbbing burn, but all she could think about was getting back to the dome. By the time she reached Outpost Delta, the artificial twilight of the dome's cycle had begun. She punched in the override code with a trembling, blood-stained finger. The heavy airlock hissed open. Josephine collapsed just inside the threshold, her back against the cold plasteel wall. She was exhausted, dizzy from blood loss, and shivering. "Liam, Alaric," she breathed out. Almost instantly, the thick foliage parted. The 2 Ursavines padded out. At first, they approached with their usual playful demeanor, expecting food or affection. But as they closed the distance to 20 feet, both massive creatures froze simultaneously. Their 4 nostrils flared. The complex olfactory glands of the Apexia tartarus could detect a single drop of blood in a gallon of water, could read the emotional state of a creature from the cortisol in their sweat. They smelled the rust-copper scent of human blood. Josephine's blood. Liam moved first, low to the ground, creeping forward not like a pet, but like a predator assessing a wounded member of its pack. He approached Josephine, his massive head lowering to her lap. Gently, with a delicacy that defied his crushing jaw strength, he nudged the blood-soaked fabric wrapped around her wrists. Alaric flanked her other side, his clicking and chuffing entirely silenced. They inhaled deeply. Through the scent of Josephine's blood and sweat, they isolated the foreign contaminants. They smelled the sterile, synthetic ozone of the Hemlock Faulkner corporate spire. They smelled the microscopic metallic shavings of the compliance cuffs. And beneath it all, they caught the distinct, sour, pheromonal residue of Vincent Cole's sweat from where he had grabbed her arms. Josephine looked up, her vision swimming, and saw something that sent a chill down her spine. The Ursavines were no longer purring. The dense armored scutes along Liam's spine slowly began to stand on end, a physiological reaction indicating extreme, lethal aggression. His 4 amber eyes dilated until they were bottomless pools of black. A sound began to emanate from deep within Alaric's chest, not a purr, but a low, rhythmic thrumming that sounded like a war drum. They didn't just understand that their matriarch was injured. Their hyper-intelligent brains had analyzed the scent profile, mapped the aggression, and recognized the intent. They knew she had been attacked, and they knew the exact chemical signature of the man who did it. Liam stood up, his full, terrifying 8-foot height towering over the wounded human. He let out a silent snarl, revealing rows of serrated, obsidian teeth. He looked toward the reinforced doors of the dome, toward the direction of the colonial settlement. Josephine watched as the cubs she had bottle-fed transformed back into the apex terrors of Kepler 186F. They weren't just angry, they were hunting. And, God help the men who had drawn their mother's blood. The medical bay inside Outpost Delta was little more than a sterilized closet, but it had what she needed. Josephine ripped open a packet of quick-clot combat gauze, standard issue for frontier biologists, and packed it tightly into the deep, ragged lacerations on her wrists. The hemostatic agent burned like battery acid, as it chemically fused with her blood to stop the bleeding, forcing a sharp, breathless gasp from her lungs. She wrapped her forearms in heavy pressure bandages, her hands trembling violently. Outside the medbay, the dome was unnervingly silent. No purring, no playful chuffs. She walked back into the main biome. The artificial jungle was bathed in the low light cycle, casting long, sharp shadows across the synthetic ferns and towering faux wood canopies. Liam and Alaric were gone. They hadn't fled. They had vanished into the terrain they knew better than their own reflections. Suddenly, the ground beneath Josephine's boots shuddered. A low, mechanical rumble reverberated through the plasteel walls of the dome, accompanied by the distinct, high-pitched whine of heavy servo motors. Josephine stumbled to the perimeter security terminal, a ruggedized Cisco interface, and brought up the external cameras. Her breath caught in her throat. Hemlock Faulkner wasn't waiting for a magistrate or a court order. Darian Eris had found his loophole. The external feed showed a tactical strike force advancing on the dome under the harsh glare of halogen floodlights. But this wasn't standard corporate security. Eris had hired private contractors' deniable assets. Their tactical gear bore the faded, unmarked insignias of former Constellus PMC operatives, a notorious private military group from Earth that specialized in hostile asset liquidation. They were backed by serious hardware. 2 heavily modified Caterpillar D, 11 autonomous dozers, retrofitted with reinforced plows and sonic disruptor cannons, were rolling over the delicate obsidian flora of the Tartarus Basin. Flanking the strike team were 4 Boston Dynamics Cerberus variant quadruped drones, their mounted FLIR, forward-looking infrared, optics scanning the dome's perimeter. Eris was framing this as a biohazard containment breach. If the Ursivines were dead and the outpost destroyed, there would be no one left to dispute the claim to the palladium vein. "Attention! Outpost Delta," Vincent Cole's voice boomed over a heavy-duty LRAD speaker, shaking the leaves of the artificial canopy. "This is a code red containment operation. The indigenous bioforms are deemed an immediate threat to colony infrastructure. Dr. Croft, you are ordered to exit the facility immediately. We are breaching in 60 seconds. Cowards," Josephine hissed, her fingers flying across the Cisco terminal. She tried to patch a distress signal through to the UN labor observers in the colonial settlement, but the screen flashed red. Signal jammed. The PMC squad had deployed a local mesh network jammer. She was entirely cut off. Crack. The dome shook violently as the lead Caterpillar dozer slammed its reinforced plow into the primary airlock. The plasteel groaned, buckling under the immense hydraulic pressure. Alarms blared, bathing the biome in flashing red emergency lights. Crack. The heavy doors gave way, tearing off their pneumatic hinges. The humid air of the sanctuary rushed out, instantly replaced by the cold, smog-laced atmosphere of Kepler. 1865. "Move in. Weapons hot. Shoot to kill," Cole's voice echoed through the breach. A squad of 8 heavily armed contractors poured into the sanctuary, their boots crunching on the synthetic soil. They carried Heckler & Koch MP-7 submachine guns loaded with armor-piercing depleted uranium rounds, overkill for most wildlife, but entirely necessary for the armored scutes of an adult Ursivine. The Boston Dynamics drones trotted in behind them, their mechanical joints whirring, their thermal cameras sweeping the dense foliage. Josephine ducked behind the reinforced structural pillar of the control booth, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to protect the cubs. She looked wildly into the dark canopy. "Liam! Alaric! Hide!" she whisper-shouted, hoping her voice wouldn't carry over the tactical chatter of the PMC squad. But the Ursivines did not hide. High above, in the thickest part of the artificial canopy, 2 massive predators watched the intruders. Their hyper-intelligent minds processed the situation with chilling efficiency. They saw the kinetic weapons. They heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of the mechanical drones. And most importantly, they smelled the intruders. They smelled the ozone, the gun oil, the adrenaline of the contractors. And leading the pack, smelling of fear masked by arrogance, was the distinct, sour, metallic scent of the man who had drawn their matriarch's blood. The hunt had begun. A contractor named Garrett, point man for the right flank, pushed through a thick cluster of broadleaf ferns, his MP-7 raised. "I got nothing on thermals," Garrett muttered over the comms. "These things are supposed to be the size of tanks. Where the hell are they?" "Keep your eyes peeled, Garrett," The drones are picking up residual heat signatures, but the ambient humidity is messing with the sensors, Cole barked from the rear. Garrett took another step. He never saw the threat. In a display of terrifying biological adaptation, Alaric had ruptured a localized climate control pipe overhead, coating his armored body in the dome's sub-zero Freon cooling gel. His thermal signature was entirely masked. Without a sound, Alaric dropped from the canopy. A terrifying 2,000 pounds of muscle and armored scutes landed directly on the Boston Dynamics drone next to Garrett. The machine was crushed instantly, its titanium chassis snapping like a dry twig under Alaric's 6 massive paws. Garrett spun around, shouting in panic, pulling the trigger of his MP7. But Alaric was faster. With a swipe of his primary forelimb, he batted the weapon away. The submachine gun shattered against a plasteel tree trunk. Alaric didn't bite. He didn't use his claws. Josephine had taught them not to kill humans. Instead, the massive beast slammed his wedge-shaped head into Garrett's Cry precision chest plate. The kinetic force threw the contractor 20 feet through the air, knocking him unconscious before he even hit the ground. By the time the rest of the squad swung their tactical lights toward the noise, Alaric had already vanished back into the shadows, leaving nothing but a crushed multi-million-dollar drone and an incapacitated soldier. "Contact! Right flank!" someone screamed. "Fire! Light up the canopy!" Cole roared. The jungle erupted into deafening gunfire. Tracers lit up the dome, shredding the artificial foliage, but they were firing at ghosts. The tactical advantage of the Constellas squad disintegrated in less than 3 minutes. They were trained to fight insurgents, other humans who relied on lines of sight and radio communication. They were not prepared for apex predators that communicated through subsonic frequencies and hunted via molecular scent tracking. "Drone 2 is down. I repeat, Drone 2 is offline," a contractor yelled, panic bleeding into his disciplined voice. On the left flank, Liam had struck. He didn't drop from the trees. He tunneled beneath the synthetic soil, utilizing the soft earth designed for root expansion. He erupted from the ground directly beneath the second group. A terrifying roar, loud enough to burst eardrums, paralyzed the men for a crucial microsecond. Liam swept his heavy, armored tail, a limb covered in interlocking keratin spikes, shattering the knees of a contractor in heavy armor. As the man fell, screaming, Liam crushed his comms relay with a single, precise bite, then melted back into the underbrush as a hail of gunfire chewed up the dirt where he had just been. "Hold your fire! You're shooting at shadows," Cole screamed, his cybernetic eye whirring as it tried and failed to track the hyper-agile beasts. "Form a perimeter around the breach. Don't let them separate us." But the Ursavines were executing a textbook isolation tactic. They weren't trying to slaughter the squad. They were systematically dismantling their technological superiority. Another Boston Dynamics drone sparked and died as a heavy plasteel branch, strategically gnawed through by Alaric, plummeted from the canopy and crushed its sensor array. From the control booth, Josephine watched the chaos unfold. The jamming signal was localized, tied to a portable transmitter one of the contractors was wearing. If she could bypass it using the dome's hardwired subterranean telemetry cables, she could still reach the UN. Ignoring the throbbing agony in her wrists, she crawled under the main console, prying open the floor grating. She spliced her blood-stained wrist pad directly into the raw fiber-optic cables meant for seismic monitoring. Come on," she prayed, her bloody fingers slipping on the tiny glass wires. Out in the biome, the situation for the PMC squad was becoming desperate. 3 men were down alive, but out of the fight with broken limbs and shattered armor. Their heavy weapons were useless against an enemy that moved faster than human reflexes could track and struck with the force of a freight train. "Fall back," Cole finally ordered, realizing the slaughter that awaited them if they stayed. "Back to the dozers. We'll level the whole damn dome from the outside." The remaining contractors began a frantic, disciplined retreat toward the shattered airlock. But as Vincent Cole backed away, his MP7 raised. The thick, artificial fog rolled in around him. He took a step backward, his boot hitting something solid. He assumed it was a plasteel tree trunk. It breathed. Cole froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. A low, vibrating thrum echoed through his chest cavity, the sound of a war drum. He slowly turned his head. Towering above him, blocking the exit, was Liam. The Ursavine wasn't masked in cooling gel. He wasn't hiding. He was standing in full view, under the flashing red emergency lights. His armored scutes flared, making him look twice his massive size. His 4 amber eyes locked directly onto Cole's face. Cole raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before the firing pin could drop, a blur of motion struck him from the side. Alaric had flanked him. The second Ursavine didn't attack Cole's body. He clamped his crushing jaws directly over the barrel and receiver of the Heckler and Koch MP7. With a sickening crunch of high-grade steel and polymer, Alaric bit the weapon completely in half, spitting the ruined magazine into the dirt. Cole scrambled backward, drawing a heavy combat knife from his thigh sheath. He was hyperventilating, his cybernetic eye darting between the 2 towering monsters. The other contractors were at the airlock, but they didn't fire. They couldn't. Liam and Alaric had positioned themselves so that any shot fired at them would hit Cole. They had taken a hostage. Liam took a slow, deliberate step forward. He lowered his massive head until he was inches from Cole's face. The beast inhaled deeply, the sound like a vacuum. He was smelling the sweat, the fear, and the residue of Josephine's blood still on Cole's uniform. Liam let out a terrifying, bone-rattling snarl, exposing rows of serrated teeth. But he didn't bite. Instead, Liam raised his right forelimb. Cole flinched, bracing for the blow that would tear his head off. But Liam didn't strike. Gently, almost mockingly, the Ursavine tapped the heavy, blood-stained compliance cuff that still dangled from Cole's tactical belt, the very cuff he had forced onto Josephine's wrists. Cole's remaining human eye went wide with absolute primal terror. They know, he realized. These animals know exactly what I did. Inside the control booth, a green light finally pulsed on Josephine's bypass terminal. She had broken through the jammer. UN Colonial Oversight. This is Dr. Josephine Croft, at Outpost Delta. She spoke rapidly into her comms, broadcasting on all open emergency frequencies, including the Colonial public channels. I am transmitting live security footage of an illegal armed corporate raid on a federally protected sanctuary by Hemlock Faulkner. She hit the transmit button, sending the high-definition video of the heavily armed PMC squad, the destroyed drones, and the modified Caterpillar dozers directly to the magistrate's office, the UN observers, and every news terminal in New Jamestown. The animals are defending themselves, Josephine's voice echoed out over the dome's remaining intact speakers, loud enough for Cole and the retreating squad to hear. If you kill them, Director Eris, the whole galaxy watches you do it, and I'll see you hang for war crimes. Cole stood frozen, surrounded by the 2 enraged apex predators. His earpiece crackled with the frantic voice of Darian Eris. Cole, abort. The magistrate just issued an immediate warrant. The UN marshals are scrambling dropships right now. Get out of there, you idiot. Cole dropped his knife. He raised his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving Liam's. We're leaving, Cole whispered, his voice trembling. We're leaving. Liam stared at the man for a long, agonizing moment. Then, the massive beast snorted, a blast of hot, ozone-scented air hitting Cole's face. Liam stepped aside, a clear, intelligent dismissal. Run, little prey. Cole didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted for the shattered airlock, pushing past his limping men, fleeing into the crimson night. The United Nations dropships did not land. They slammed into the crimson dust of Kepler, 186F like the hammer of a furious god. Their heavy thrusters baked the synthetic soil of Sector 4, as 4 heavily armored gunships established a defensive perimeter around the shattered dome of Outpost Delta. The blinding blue and white halogen spotlights of the UN peacekeeping force cut through the artificial fog, illuminating the wreckage of the corporate raid. Josephine sat on the crushed chassis of one of the Boston Dynamics drones, shivering under a foil thermal blanket. A UN field medic, a gruff woman named Sarah, was carefully peeling away the blood-soaked quick-clot gauze from Josephine's wrists. You tore through the superficial veins and nearly hit the radial artery, Doctor. Croft, Sarah muttered, applying a cold, numbing spray of dermal regenerator. Whoever put those compliance cuffs on you cranked the tension to maximum. It's a miracle you didn't lose the use of your hands entirely. I had to break the scanner, Josephine whispered, her voice raspy and exhausted. She looked down at her freshly bandaged arms. Crisp, white synth silk had replaced the torn, bloody cotton. Across the perimeter, the scene was one of absolute, humiliating defeat for Hemlock Faulkner. The remaining Constellus PMC contractors had been disarmed and forced onto their knees, their hands zip-tied behind their heads. Vincent Cole sat among them, staring blankly into the dirt. He was trembling. A UN marshal was reading him his rights, citing violations of the Outer Space Treaty and the International Accords on Lethal Force. But Cole didn't seem to hear him. He kept flinching at every shadow, his cybernetic eye darting toward the dark tree line of the biome. A sleek, unmarked diplomatic shuttle touched down near the airlock, and a man in a sharp, slate-gray suit stepped out. He bypassed the tactical teams and walked directly toward Josephine. He flashed a holographic badge. Dr. Croft, I am Harrison Smith, Chief Prosecutor for the International Criminal Court's Exoplanetary Division at The Hague, he said, his tone crisp but not unkind. We intercepted your broadcast. I believe you have single-handedly triggered the largest corporate stock crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. Josephine managed a weak, exhausted smile. What about Eris? Darian Eris is currently locked inside his penthouse suite at the corporate spire, Smith replied, adjusting his cuffs. He retained the services of Kirkland and Ellis, back on Earth, within 3 minutes of your broadcast going live. But no corporate law firm can save him from this. He authorized the use of illegal kinetic weapons and unregistered PMC assets on a UN-sanctioned UN worker. Interpol's extraterrestrial division is cutting through his blast doors as we speak. Smith paused, looking at the massive, sheared-off airlock doors and the neatly bisected Heckler and Koch MP7 lying in the dirt. But there is another matter, Doctor. The footage you broadcast. It is currently being analyzed by a joint panel of biologists in Geneva. Josephine tensed. If you're going to tell me they are too dangerous. Quite the opposite, Smith interrupted, raising a hand. The tactical coordination your companions displayed tonight. The localized thermal evasion. The deliberate destruction of communication relays without inflicting lethal casualties on the intruders. Dr. Croft, that is not the behavior of mere apex predators acting on instinct. Smith leaned in, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of a career-defining legal precedent. They recognized a hostage situation. They utilized psychological warfare. By morning, the UN Science Directorate will officially petition to reclassify the Apexia tartarus not as indigenous fauna, but as an emergent, sapient species. And under interstellar law, you cannot claim mineral rights on land occupied by sapient natives. Hemlock Faulkner just lost their trillion-dollar palladium vein forever. Josephine let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years. She leaned her head back against the cold plasteel of the destroyed drone, the tears finally coming. She had won. The sanctuary was safe. Speaking of your companions, Smith said, taking a cautious step back and gesturing toward the shattered entrance of the dome, I believe they are waiting for clearance. Josephine opened her eyes. Standing at the edge of the halogen light, just beyond the perimeter of armed UN soldiers, were Liam and Alaric. They were covered in mud, cooling gel, and the debris of the artificial jungle, looking like ancient, mythical guardians of the forest. The UN peacekeepers immediately raised their rifles, the terrifying reputation of the beasts overriding their discipline. Stand down. Josephine screamed, her voice cracking like a whip. She stood up, throwing off the thermal blanket. Lower your weapons right now. Smith nodded to the strike team commander. Do as she says. Lower them. The soldiers nervously lowered their rifles. Though they kept their hands hovering over the triggers, the air was thick with tension. Josephine walked forward, stepping out of the bright medical lights and into the shadows, where the two massive creatures waited. She didn't walk like a conqueror. She walked like a mother who had just found her lost children. Liam moved first. The terrifying armored giant who had systematically dismantled an elite mercenary squad mere minutes ago now crept forward with his head bowed. His 6 limbs moving with agonizing care, he let out a soft, questioning chuff. Alaric followed, flanking her. They lowered their massive heads, their 4 amber eyes focusing entirely on Josephine's forearms. They could see the stark white of the new bandages. Josephine knelt in the dirt, ignoring the sting in her knees, and held out her hands, palms up. Liam approached, his terrifying jaws parting slightly. He inhaled deeply. He was scent testing. He searched for the smell of the metallic razor teeth. He searched for the scent of her fear, the coppery tang of fresh blood, and the sour pheromones of the man who had hurt her. He found none of it. He smelled the sterile, bitter scent of the UN medical regenerator. He smelled the clean synth silk. He smelled Josephine's exhaustion. But beneath it, the overwhelming, soaring scent of human relief. The danger had passed. The bleeding had stopped. Alaric nudged his massive, wedge-shaped head under Josephine's right hand, lifting it gently so it rested against his armored secondary ear. Liam pressed his snout against her chest, letting his enormous weight rest against her in a gesture of absolute, unshakable trust. Then, it started. It began as a low subsonic vibration in the dirt beneath Josephine's boots. It resonated through the crushed plasteel, through the cold night air, and deep into the chests of the terrified UN soldiers watching from the perimeter. It grew louder, a deep rumbling engine of pure, resonant sound. The ursivines were purring. Josephine buried her face in the coarse, ozone-scented fur of Liam's neck, wrapping her newly bandaged arms around his massive shoulders. They were predators, yes. They were terrifying, lethal, and unforgiving to those who threatened their own. But as Josephine held them in the aftermath of the battle, she proved the greatest truth of human expansion into the stars. Humanity didn't conquer the galaxy with weapons or greed. They conquered it with the profound, radical capacity to look at the darkest, most dangerous corners of the universe and call it family. If this tale of survival, unbreakable bonds, and the undeniable power of interspecies loyalty kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button, share this story with fellow sci-fi lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling exoplanet adventures. Your support helps us bring the galaxy's greatest untold stories right to your screen. Join our pack today.